In casual D&D parlance, you will likely have heard the term Dark Elf and Drow used interchangeably, and they are indeed used this way, and is technically not incorrect. But this was not always the case, and the distinction is at once both a historical and a magical one. Now, the following history can get quite confusing, but worry not. The many names of elven nations and the particulars are less important than the overall thrust of the history, which I hope to both convey accurately and understandably. The ancestors of what would come to be known as the Dark Elves, and still later the Drow, arrived in Faerun over 28,000 years ago, and they were called Green Elves. They were imported to Toril, after a fashion, after powerful Fae, who were frustrated with tyrannical draconic rule, opened up portals from the Feywild to Toril in an effort to undermine the dragons, who were ascended at the time. Now, how much this actually led to an undermining of draconic rule is not clear. However, one group of Green Elves forged a truce with the dragons and carved out a small kingdom for themselves. How this was accomplished, no one knows, but it was the first elven state to have been founded on Faerun, with a capital city called Atranosh. These Green Elves were called the Illithiri, a name you have certainly heard me speak of before. These elves did not originally worship the Sundering, and it is known that they were not aware of an organized pantheon of elven gods as such, and were said initially to have originally revered Fey powers. But over time, the Illithiri discovered the dark elven deity and son of Lolth, Veyron, and in subsequent centuries many of the Illithiri converted to his faith, as it suited both their spiritual and practical needs. Practically speaking, the Illithiri were always more inclined towards cruelty, ambition, and above all expansionism, traits exemplified by the god Veyron, and thus the relationship between the god and his followers in Illithir worked well. These Dark Elves at the time did not resemble what one is familiar with when it comes to modern Drow. Rather than sporting obsidian skin and hair as white as alabaster, they instead had dark brown skin and hair that was either dark brown or black. Neither were their eyes red, as is frequently the case among Drow, but rather the normal spectrum of elven eye colors. And they did not possess the dark vision of modern Drow. This dark phenotype was dominant amongst the Green Elves of Illithir, and it is for this appearance that they probably first became known as Dark Elves, whereas other Green Elves were paler of both skin and hair. Other Dark Elven realms would emerge after some time as the first flowering, a period marking the beginning of elven ascendancy in Faerun, began in earnest after the decline of the dragons, and other elven nations not of Dark Elf origin emerged during this time as well, primarily those of Moon and Sun Elves. At this time, there were acceptable relations between the Dark Elven nations and the other Elven nations. However, many, particularly those amongst the Moon and Sun Elves, were not fully aware of the degree of evil that had been cultivated in Dark Elven lands. In addition to Veyron, as the major god for many Dark Elves of Illithir, there was in fact a small following of the goddess Illithiri, who opposed her brother, but this cult had insufficient influence to do so effectively. And more importantly, the Dark Elves had been courting other evil deities over the millennia. Gonadar, for example, the depraved god of slimes and oozes, and still later, of course, Lolth, the Spider Queen. In time, it became impossible to ignore how different the Illithiri were and differently they conducted themselves. Slavery in Illithir was normal and institutionalized, including the enslavement of other elves, and their drive to expand saw them justifying conquest and murder as tools to be availed of, something that was anathema to most other elves. And this cultural gap grew ever larger between the Illithiri and the other elves over time. Things came to a head when the other elven races, the Moon Elves, the Wood Elves, and above all the Sun Elves, decided to draw a clear line in the sand and create an elven nation wholly separate from the continent of Faerun and wholly excluding Illithir. They did not seek to kill them or drive them away, but rather ignore them by creating a piece of land that would be entirely free of the Dark Elves. In 17,600 before Dale Reckoning, elven high mages cast a spell of unprecedented power that led to the creation of Evermeet, an enchanted isle that would become sacred to all Telquizir, or elves, with the notable exception, of course, of the Dark Elves. This island, once created, would be closed off to all non-elves for all time, protected by powerful magics, and indeed by the elven gods themselves. But Evermeet's creation, born of the desire to exclude the Dark Elves and others, however rightly or wrongly, led to one of the great cataclysms of Faerunian history, an event referred to as the First Sundering. This was no simple spell, nor a spell born of standard casting or even extensive preparation. Rather, it was sorcery on a near deific scale that required centuries of preparation, and thus the preparation for this spell actually began many centuries before it was cast. A majestic tower was built in the heart of Faerun, made of resplendent white granite, taller than any structure ever built before by the elves, seemingly touching the clouds themselves and reflecting the colors of the sky. The structure was such that each mage that was to participate in the ritual had a seat built into the tower alongside its winding staircase, engraved with the name of the mage who would occupy it during the casting. After centuries of planning, the best and brightest mages of all elven races, save for those of the Dark Elves, were summoned to the tower to participate in this monumental casting. However, all mages who had participated in the casting had their souls ripped from their bodies as the magic of the weave coursed through them, with their souls being used to empower the spell. The only mage who survived was a green elf called Starleaf, the mage who had initiated the casting, and as all the other mages had died, she alone felt the destruction they had wrought upon Faerun, as the continent was torn asunder to create an island far to the west in the trackless sea. The coasts were laid waste to by devastating earthquakes and tsunamis, and hundreds upon hundreds of elven settlements were destroyed, and those that were not were forever changed. Perhaps most significant of all, and most relevant to the future of the Dark Elves, was the destruction and leveling of the city Atarnash, the capital of the Dark Elven Empire of Illithiri. Nor did other parts of their empire escape unscathed. Countless Dark Elves died, and most of these were worshippers of the god Veyron, with many of the remaining survivors being worshippers of Lolth, and thus indirectly, the creation of the Isle of Evermeet was partly responsible for the ascendancy of the Spider Queen as the primary deity of the Dark Elves, as millennia of scheming culminated in her domination of the Dark Elves, and she no longer faced the stiff competition from her son Veyron, nor her daughter Illithiri. As the Illithiri had deliberately been excluded from the ritual, and also suffered from massive destruction and loss of life from the spell, matters between them and the other elves grew ever more tense. Above all, the Sun Elves, who had been the de facto orchestrators of the high magic ritual. Between the other elves, this was added to by the fact that not all elves had agreed to the creation of Evermeet to begin with. Regardless, the Dark Elves of Illithiri would never forget this. A century after the creation of Evermeet, 3 elven realms comprising Green Elves, Moon Elves, and Sun Elves, Thearnatar, Ielur, and Siorpir, attempted to unify themselves into a single nation, but Illithiri assassins sabotaged these efforts by eliminating the leaders of these realms from behind the scenes, whilst deceiving them into believing that each of the other 3 nations had been responsible for the assassination of its respective leader, plunging the 3 countries, former allies of each other, into chaos. And a war called the War of 3 Leaves that lasted 3 centuries was waged. But eventually, it came to light that the Illithiri had been chiefly responsible, and had intentionally pinned the blame on the other participants, and hostilities ceased. This led to resentment and conflict with the Dark Elves, though not as yet outright war. The distrust, tension, and occasional conflict between the Illithiri and the other elven nations continued for millennia, and eventually, other dark elven nations that had emerged over time were drawn into it, such as the nation of Mieratar, an offshoot nation founded by green and dark elves. However, not all non-dark elves were patient and virtuous, and the Sun Elf nation of Aravandar had been attempting to annex Mieratar for centuries, by means of diplomacy, political pressure, and espionage, culminating, however, in failure, and greedy and impatient leaders of a clan, the Vishan, outright declared war on Mieratar in 12,000 before Dale Reckoning, thus commencing the First Crown War, a series of overlapping wars and conflicts that would last 3 millennia, with some continuing as others were starting. The First Crown War ended in victory for the Sun Elves of Aravandar, and in the conquest and subjugation of the Dark Elves of Mieratar. The Second Crown War was begun in 11,700 before Dale Reckoning by the Dark Elven realm of Illithiri, under the pretense of solidarity with their Dark Elven brethren in Mieratar, who had been annexed and conquered in the previous war. They attacked a Moon Elf kingdom, another realm, called Orishar, which then further escalated to include other elven realms, such as Thearnatar, Ielur, and Siorpir, with whom they had experienced conflict millennia prior. The Second Crown War spanned centuries, and led to the utter annihilation of the aforementioned elven kingdoms, and it was at this time that the term Darrow, meaning traitor in the Elvish language, was first used as an epithet, an insult, to describe the Dark Elves of Illithiri, a term that would later be corrupted and shortened to Drow, and would encompass all Dark Elves, as the violence they had committed and the unspeakable dark magics they had used had been unprecedented in Elven lands. It was also at this time that Lolth personally sent her Balor servant, Wendonai, to further corrupt the ruling families of Illithiri by teaching them ever more powerful demonic magics, allowing them to summon demonic servants from the abyss. Before the Second Crown War had come to a close, the Sun Elves of Eravandar, who had come to be called the Vishantar Empire after their previous conquests, attacked another elven kingdom in 10,900 before Dale Reckoning, composed of fellow Sun Elves and Moon Elves, after Kord's diplomacy and negotiations had failed. A recurrent pattern with the Sun Elves of the Vishantar Empire, beginning the Third Crown War. And after 300 years of war, this realm that the Vishantar had besieged, Chantel Othreyr, was conquered. It also had partially come to light at this time that the Vishantar Empire had had dealings with devils, and that some of their leadership had been corrupted by infernal magics and pacts, ultimately having been aided and abetted by the devil and fallen Solar, Malkazid, who once served Corellin Lerithian before he was banished to the Nine Hells. Some centuries later, an event called the Dark Disaster occurred. In 10,500 before Dale Reckoning, a series of unimaginably powerful and magically created storms ravaged the dark elven nation of Miuratar, leveling it to the ground and turning it into a barren wasteland. There were two competing theories considered for the cause. The first one being that the high mages of the Vishantar Empire, corrupted as they were by infernal influence, had caused it, and the second one being that it was the result of accidental magic gone awry on Miuratar's side, although there was never clear evidence for either theory. In response to this, the Illithiri, believing the Sun Elf mages to be responsible for destroying their Dark Elven brethren's land, launched an attack of unprecedented savagery on the Vishantar Empire in 10,450 before Dale Reckoning, beginning the Fourth Crown War. No longer attempting to hide their demonic ties, they openly wielded evil abyssal magic, and flaunted their worship of Lolth, the Spider Queen. The degree of malice, sheer corruption, and atrocities committed by the Illithiri at this time astonished the other elves, and led to the decision of the other elven nations to expel the Illithiri from the grace of Corellin Lerithian forever. The non-dark elven nations came together in 10,000 before Dale Reckoning, and the most powerful high mages worked jointly with the most powerful clerics of the elves, empowered by Corellin Lerithian himself, completing a ritual that transformed and banished all dark elves, whether Illithiri or not, to the Underdark. Their features changed, taking on the traditional ashen white and bleached hair of the Drow. Their skin darkened still further, to the familiar ebony-black of modern Dark Elves, and their eyes took on a red hue. And all of this was coupled by a crippling sensitivity to sunlight, depriving them of their senses and health, and drawing them to the Underdark, like moths to a flame. There is the matter as to why the magic in question affected all Dark Elves, rather than only the corrupt nation of Illithiri, particularly when considering that the magic had had the backing of Corellin Lerithian himself. Some simply considered it collateral damage, but the truth is far more sinister. Despite their infernal corruption, it was not widely known that the Sun Elves of the Vishantar Empire had been compromised, and they had had a major hand in the high magic ritual. And they had always intended for all Dark Elves, whatever their providence, to be forever bound to the Faersres, or radiation of the Underdark, compelling them to journey there and to remain. Within 2 months, any remaining Drow were driven underground by the joint forces of the Surface Elves, an event sometimes referred to as the Descent of the Drow. The Gold Elves of the Vishantar Empire would eventually get their comeuppance in the Fifth Crown War, as a divinely mandated elven court decreed them responsible for the Crown Wars, whereupon, in an act of madness, they attacked the other elven nations, and were eliminated from the face of Faerun by 9,000 before Dale Reckoning. Thus, 3,000 years after they had begun, the Crown Wars came to an end. Over the ensuing millennia, the Drow would adapt to their new environment, and create their own civilization, all under the sinister guidance of Lolth, the Spider Queen. But the question remains, are Dark Elves the same as Drow? In every contemporary Faerunian context, yes, but historically, as I have sought to elucidate, they were distinct. It is still possible for modern Drow to gradually acclimate to the sunlit lands, as some Drow have managed this, but it is painful and takes a great deal of time, and whatever abilities they have are typically lost when outside of the Underdark, and thus very few venture forth from there without good cause, and when they do so at night. Of course, in a Baldur's Gate 3 context, a so-called Seldarian Drow would be one wholly adapted to life on the surface, whereas a low-sworn Drow would not be, although the intricacies of the differences between them, such as the loss of powers due to sunlight sensitivity, will practically and understandably never be implemented, something most of us are perfectly fine with, myself included. After all, lore and history are very important, but fun takes precedence. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.